All right, so today we're going to go over Substance Designer. I'm not expecting you to jump right into this if you don't feel comfortable moving to beyond just a color texture. But for those of you who are starting to get familiar with Marmoset, this will help you start to have some fun materials that will show off not just the color map, but also your roughness and your metalness, which are going to be essential down the line for presenting realistic props. So Substance is pretty cool. It's a lot like Photoshop if Photoshop was node based instead of working in modifier layers, and I will show you what I mean. I'm going to work on the crate I made last week again. So starting a new project, what you have to begin with is an output node for your base color, an output node for your normal map, an output node for your roughness map, metalness, ambient occlusion, and height. I find that I don't usually need ambient occlusion or height maps, so I don't usually work with those for Marmoset. So I start with these four as my basic maps. So I'm gonna bring in my crate so I can preview my texture on the crate. You don't need to have a model in order to work in a Substance Designer, but if you have one in mind that you're planning to work with, it can be really helpful. So I just drag it onto the package, and under my resources, now I have my crate. Double click on it, and the crate will appear in the window, and as I change things in here, the crate should change as well after I right click on this guy. Sorry. Right click on this guy, view outputs in 3D view. So now anything that happens in here happens over here too. So I'm I already baked last week, so I'm gonna use the same bakes I used last week, and we're gonna use that to texture this model procedurally instead of doing any painting whatsoever. I baked a couple more maps, like the normal object and position map. Or I went over position map last week, so I'll just show you what an object space normals do this week, because they're fun. So just take your PSTs that you got out of Marmoset or Handpoint Baker, and just drag them over into the graph, and they'll take a second to load. So just a second. Okay, so right off the bat, you have your baked files as output nodes or input nodes in here that you can preview. Click on in your preview windows down here to see what you're working with. So there's my curvature, my ambient occlusion, my material ID, my normal map, my normal position map, or my object space normal map, and my position map. Position map is a bit easier to visualize here. What it does is, let's see, I think it's red is red, or green is up and down, red is forward and backward, and blue is left to right. So when you apply this to the drag the node, connect it to the output for the color, and you can start to see what that looks like on the model and get a bit more information on like how these things work. So that's just that. If I want to preview my ambient occlusion, I can drag that over there too. This is what I did separately, was also bake a low poly ambient occlusion that does not include all the detail. You don't have to do that, but if you want specific shadows, it's fun to add that. So this is my high poly ambient occlusion. You can see that previewed. Same thing for the curvature. Make sure that that's all clean. My material ID, so I can get an idea of make sure everything is masked that I want to be masked. A normal map, I don't, well, I can drag that to here just to see what that looks like. But if I want to start to see how it affects the model, I can drag it onto the normal output. This is a normal node. You don't need to worry about that right now. I'll go over that later. But what it does is it converts a grayscale height map into a normal map. So that'll be really useful once we get into materials that have their own normals that are unaffected by the full normals. And what you'll notice here is this looks a little funky. So what you want one important thing to do beforehand is to edit your material and make sure that DirectX normal is turned off, because Marmoset and some other programs by default bake OpenGL renderer normals. And what that means is for DirectX, the green channel is inverted. So black is down, white is up for some reason, or black is, or yeah, either way. So they're two inverted things. So if your model looks a little weird, it might be because your normal map is inverted on the green channel. And then we have the object-based normal map, which is a lot like the position map, but it's specific to the normals, and it includes normal information. So we can use that for interesting lighting effects and some other things that I'll go over later. But for right now, we'll start with a blank 50% gray. So over here, when you click on a node, you get the parameters over here. So what we have here is a uniform color node. If you hit space, you start to get a list of all these various nodes you can use. Over here, you have your library, also of things you can use. There's a lot here, and it all looks very complex, and it is, but when you get down to it, this is all things that you can learn by experimentation, but what you really need mostly is up here up top. So this paint bucket tool is your most valuable, is your uniform color, and it is just a droplet of color that you can control over here like you would your Photoshop color picker. I'm going to start with, if I switch from float to HSV, turn on HSV, turn float on. That float sets it to 1 to 0 rather than 255 to 0. 255 is just a thing the computer likes, so don't worry about that. So I want 0.5, and that'll be my basic gray. So what I had you doing last week in Photoshop was using overlay blend modes to achieve the same effect that we're going to do with nodes here. So when you want to combine two things in Substance Designer, you're going to use a blend node. And that is, I don't know what that looks like up here, but if you press space at any point, you bring up the contextual menu where you can select nodes on the fly. So I'm working, I hit space, I see blend is right here. I can start typing if I need blend, and blend comes up. So a blend node takes a background, a foreground, and an opacity mask. So the opacity mask is like what you would plug in Photoshop when I had you do the material masks. So a black-white mask, say, I'm just going to use a checker as an example. So if I plug in a black-white mask here, it's going to blend the foreground in the white spaces and the background in the black spaces. So I'll put my ambient occlusion in the background and say my color map in the foreground, and what I get is a blended checker like so. And that's loads of fun. But that's not what I want to do right now. What I want to do is I don't need a mask right now because I'm going to use this like a Photoshop blend node rather than a mask blend node. So what I'm going to start with is my background will be this 50% gray, and my foreground will be my ambient occlusion. So right off the bat, by default, the blend mode is copy, and that just means that it will put whatever pixel is on the foreground on top. And this is where you control your opacity, so you control how strong the blend is. But you also have blend modes, and this is just like Photoshop. So what I'm going to use to blend the shadows from the ambient occlusion is multiply, because that will take only the darks and put them on top of the gray. So what I have now is 50% gray with the ambient occlusion shadows. So that's nice, and that's a good start. What I want to do next is also get the curvature. So I have my curvature map. If I click on this node, and click space, and click blend, it will insert a blend node along that path. And then I take my curvature node, plug it in as the foreground. Again, by default it's copying, so it's just flat overlaying my curvature map on top. But if I switch that to, just like Photoshop, the overlay blend node, it will darken the darks and lighten the lights. So now I have the ambient occlusion shadows combined with the crisp highlights and crevices of the curvature map. And this is exactly where I was in Photoshop last week when I did the same thing. And again, I can change the opacity if I don't want the shadows so strong, get less of a cartoony look. I can turn that down. so we get something a bit more grounded. Over here, the normal map can stay like this for a while because you're not going to be playing with that. If you don't want to see a node, hit the D key, and it will, if it's a solo node, it'll collapse it, and it'll get out of your way. That's what I did here as well. So I'll click on this guy, D, and now I have my combined ambient occlusion and curvature map. So what we have here is a lot of interesting nodes that we can start to work with. So we're going to start with the color map, and we're going to convert this into a black and white mask. Or rather, if you have more than one material, I'll show you. So what I'm doing here is I'm hitting space, and I'm typing in multi, because I want the multi-material blend. And this takes a second to load. And this is a huge, intimidating looking node, but it's very simple because it just has a lot of inputs and a lot of outputs. And what we want to do is we want to, over here in the attributes, we have the channels drop down, and the channels are going to match the 4 channels that we're going to end up with. So right now, I'm not working with a diffuse, so I can turn that off. I'm only working with a base color, a normal map, roughness, and metallic. So I'm going to turn off specular, and I'm going to turn off height and glossiness. So now it's down to just 4, and it's a lot more friendly looking. So what this does is it combines the 4 channels. It's like a big blend node that only works on mask bases, and it has slots for each material. So base color 1, or base color 1, normal 1, roughness 1, metallic 1, and base color 2, so on and so forth. If you go over, double click on it, and change materials to say 4, same thing, but it will let you blend 4 materials up all the way up to 16. But I'm only working with 2 today. And then there's this little node on the bottom that's not part of the material, and that's your color ID map. If you baked it in Marmoset, that's what it's spat out as matte ID. You plug that in, and now it doesn't do anything because you don't have any materials plugged in. But you can start to set it up. So down here you have a color picker, and this is material 2. So anything in the materials 2 slot will apply to anything that is this green on the material ID map. However, there's nothing green on here, so I need to change that. So if you double click on a node, it previews down here. If you single click, its properties show up over here. I'm going to click on that color picker node, and I'm going to decide that my material number 2 is going to be the eagle, and I know that that's blue on my material ID map. So I'm going to select blue. Turn up the fuzziness and padding slightly so it's a bit more generous, and I have this set up to receive 2 different materials. I don't have my materials built yet, so what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say that I want this green to be my crate, and I want my eagle to be gold. I'm going to start with yellow and a green. And what I have to begin with is, hey, look at that. So what it did, note that I only picked 1 color, even though there's 3 colors technically on here. So any color you pick, it's going to override it and say that whatever color has not been picked is going to be represented by material number 1. So in this case, both the black and the red are being represented by material 1, whereas the blue is being represented by material 2. I'm going to collapse these because I don't need to look at them right now. And I'm going to plug that into my outputs. Oops, that should be, yeah. Drag these out of the way. And what this is going to do now is it is going to combine anything I put into here and put it into here. So what I want first is I'm going to decide how this green material looks. So the green material is going to be this green. I'm going to put that down here in the corner. So the green is going to have normals. So I can plug in a normal map there. And right off the bat, it starts to look a little more correct. If you don't have anything plugged in, it's gonna say no normals, and that's just not gonna look right. Let's plug in my normals. The roughness, I'm going to start with a medium gray. Again, let's say 0.5. There's a lot of reference online for what roughness values are useful. So you can Unity has a really good roughness guide. Let's see, material charts. So this is really cool. I'll post this on the blog spot. But what it says is what the average what kind of materials you would want to be looking for, or how to build a material based on just roughness and metalness. So over here you have some examples of the base value that a metalness workflow would use. Note that a lot of these are very bright, and that's because with metalness takes a lot of color from the environment. So if there's any darkness in the environment at all, it gets sucked into the metal and reflected back out at the viewer. So you want to combine a light value with the darkness of the reflections. And smoothness, there's a lot of really good guides out there that you'll probably want to supplement this with. Smoothness is how coarse the material is. So things like chrome metal are over here, and things like concrete are over here. In physics, smoothness is represented by how it's kind of like sandpaper. So a very soft surface, light bounces right off because it doesn't have anywhere to hide. But on a porous surface or on a grainy surface, the light particles will bounce around a lot on the surface of the material, and they won't give you a clean reflection. So that's a basic look at what smoothness means. Smoothness and roughness are essentially the same thing. They're inverted, so something that's more smooth is shinier, something that's more less smooth is rougher, whereas roughness is the inverse. So 1 is very rough and 0 is very smooth. Do you have a question? Okay. So back to this. I know that the crate is going. I haven't decided on how smooth it's going to be, so I'm going to leave it at 50% roughness. And for metal, white is yes, black is no. Metal is interesting because there's a whole range of grayscale that you can choose from, but almost nothing is not either metal or not. So there's almost nothing you'll find in nature that is semi-metal, and definitely nothing in games that you'll want to represent as semi-metal. So metal should always be either white or black. White being yes, it's metal. Black being no, it's not metal. I think no gray because the engine has trouble representing that because it's like what I can't. Can you think of anything that is? Yeah. So like there's almost nothing in nature that's like half metal. So I'm gonna condense my metalness because I know that is not going to be an issue. So over here, I'm gonna start having fun with the. So first things first, I want to preview this accurately. So I'm going to add my normal map into the back end of the box. So what I have here is I want both of these to feed into the same thing. In some cases you would use a blend node, but for normal maps you don't combine the blue channel. And thankfully they have something that does that for you. So I'm going to start press space again on this line, start typing normal, and normal combine comes right up. And that is just an input for 2 normal maps. It'll combine them perfectly, and you're good to go. So that's what I'm looking at. So I have a good one. So for my crate, I want to have some interesting material variation in it. So what Substance Designer provides you with is a lot of noises. And noises are just interesting textures that tile in every direction. The tiling is huge in photorealistic texturing because we can't hand paint a lot of detail because that'll be a nightmare. So what we need is stuff that can be repeated over and over again without anybody noticing. So what we have is tiling textures. So when it tiles, that just means when you put it next to itself, it is seamless. So if I were to make this smaller, you would not be able to see the gap where one texture stops and the next texture began. It can scale infinitely and just be perfectly repeatable. The danger there is that when you start to get really repetitive, it becomes more obvious that things are being repeated. So that's where you start layering noises on top of each other, and so that the viewer can't tell like, what exactly is the repeating pattern. And that's where you layer stuff on top of itself that's like different scales. So like if I wanted to use that one again, like I'm already starting to see like, oh, this C shape is all over this texture. That looks a little strange. So what I would do then is blend. I would take a different one, like this one, lay that on top, choose an interesting blend mode, like say, actually no, I'll show you what masking is really good for. Masking is really good for breaking up noise. So what I have here is this one. I need it slightly blended over this one. So I'll take a third grayscale map that will be used as my mask, plug it in. Now I have a combined texture that is neither this one, which is its own thing, or this one, which is starting to title a little bit. So now I have a combined of the two that is slightly higher res and also does not obviously have any repeating pattern within it. I'll save that for later. So what I'm going to do is a really important thing in Substance Designer is to start thinking at the very beginning of how a texture begins. And how a texture begins is usually with a height map, especially if you're working in photorealistic textures, because any texture on your model should be able to be expressed at its most basic as a height map, with white being up and black being down. So I'm going to say that this green texture is going to have a lot of little bumps and bruises on it. So that's going to be represented by this height map. So if this was plugged in just straight off the bat as my color map, let's see. I'll address later why that's a problem. But so what this looks like is this is noise right now, and that's starting to get a little bit more interesting than just flat green. But I want to get a little more creative than that. So height maps are very versatile because they can be plugged in as normal maps. Say I plug it into this normal map, and now it starts getting bumpy right off the bat, which is pretty cool. Again, make sure your normal node is set to OpenGL, not DirectX, so that white is bumpy, black is dented. So that starts to get interesting, but I also want this information to be represented in the color map. So what I can do is I can create a blend node. I'll plug in this green as the background, and rather than using this as color information, I will use this as a mask. And what it's doing is it's blending the foreground and the white spaces and leaving the background in the black spaces. I'm going to create another color map. Control D is duplicate, so that was just duplicating that existing node. I'm going to make this one still green, but slightly brighter. And I plug that in, and you start to get this noisy green. That's not too complicated. It's not high contrast, but it starts to get that realistic look of, yeah, no material is generally like perfectly flat one color. There's always going to be a little bit of variation in it. So you can use this height map not as color information, but as a mask to combine two other things. Same thing for the roughness. I don't want it to be entirely one rough thing. Say I want the bumps that are sticking out are going to be more rough, because logically speaking, if something hits a surface, if the surface is struck, if the surface is brushed against, then the stuff that is further away from the object is going to take the brunt of the damage, and the stuff that is recessed is going to be more smooth because it is receiving less tension. So again, I'm going to use a blend node, plug this 50% gray in as the background, plug in another roughness, and for the foreground, I'm going to use a slightly lighter grayscale, because white, closer to white, is more rough. Use the height map to combine them, and now it's a little less obvious, so I'll crank this up so you can see what it's doing. What it's doing is the bumps are very rough, and the crevices are very shiny. And it's a bit more obvious with a cleaner map. So I'll use this one that's a bit more high contrast as the mask. But what it's doing is, I'll put it in here and here as well. So now these outer ones are rough and the crevices are shiny. And if I invert it, now as you can see the light cross across it, the crevices start to get very rough and very matte, whereas the center of the circle, which is very white on the roughness, is very shiny. I'll go back to this and turn that back to 50%, and that back to very rough. So we're starting to get a fairly realistic, like almost stucco material, and I'm just going to say that that's what I want to go with my box. I want it to be made out of some rough stucco material. So we're going to leave that like that because that is fine, and that will export nicely. For the metal, however, we're going to make a metallic material. So we already have the color set up. What we need now is to add in normal information and roughness information. So up here, we have our normal node. This gives us the flat normal color. And plug that in, and instantly it starts to look more correct. Roughness, again, we can start with a 50%. Grayscale, 50%. Plug that in, and it's neither too shiny, nor too rough. So you get a little bit of lighting information, and a little bit of reflection. And then for the metal, same thing. We're going to use a uniform color, switch it to grayscale, and this time instead of black, because this one's metal, we're going to turn it all the way up to 1. And right away, we're going to start to see, ooh, that starts to have metallic properties. And metal is more realistic generally when it is shinier, because you're getting more of the surrounding color information. And it starts to become a bit richer. So with metal, let's create a more convincing gold. Maybe a bit darker, maybe a bit more saturated. Maybe a bit more orange than flat yellow. And we're starting to get something gold. Turn that down. It starts to be a little bit more obvious. Yeah, that's shiny. That's shiny gold. And we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna use another mask, and we're gonna dirty this one up a bit. What I like to do, just to get something down really easy, is this whole grunge section in your library. So grunges are just like dirt splotches. Right? Start off with that, and yeah, look at that. So that's like something that would be very shiny right there, very coarse right there when it's been scuffed up and left plain gold there. So if we plug this in right off the bat, instead of our roughness map, we can start to see what that looks like. Like you start to get, oh, that's very matte right there and very shiny right there. So that's going to be some interesting noise, but we're going to blend it with some other stuff just to keep it interesting. Yeah, always work with a couple of different grunges. With everybody having access to Substance Designer, it becomes a bit obvious when you're using the stock ones instead of like combining a couple of things. So, to make your own stuff looking good, go ahead and combine things. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting bit of variation. But we don't want it to be that extreme because we want the gold to still have some reflection in it. So again, instead of using the this flat mask as our roughness, we're going to blend it. I'm using a blend node, using that medium gray as our background. I'm going to plug in a slightly rougher one in the foreground. And then it starts to have this lighting variation. What's interesting about shiny things, especially when you're getting into how realistic materials work, is there is literally no variation in the color map. All of the variation comes in the roughness. So this is how a lot of metals work, is that they don't pick up new color and they don't lose their color. Like if you leave something painted in the sun, it starts to get bleached. If you rub it up against something, it'll pick up the color of whatever it's been rubbed up against. But metals don't have that same property. So their color is generally a flat color, whereas all the variation is in the roughness map. So when light catches it, you start to see, oh, there's a lot of really interesting variation there. And they also don't have the same dented properties, unless like if they're scalloped metal, you might have some interesting stuff that you can do with a normal map. If they're like wrought iron, you might have the same kind of like stucco look to it, where it's pitted and has some fun there. But for the most part, like gold, for instance, you don't usually let it get that damaged. So what we have now is a nice two materials right there. And what we're going to do is we're going to finish it off by combining back in our curvature and ambient occlusion maps. Now, I'm not using that 50% gray anymore, so we don't need that. But what this does is this spits out a base color. If we double click on this, we can start to see what this texture looks like right now. So it is putting all that green material where the gray is, and the flat gold where the bird is. So we're going to blend in our ambient occlusion map. But what's interesting about the ambient occlusion and curvature is that they're technically grayscale images, which means that they can be used as masks and not just as color overlays, which is a nice thing that you don't get in Photoshop. So if you plug this into the opacity map, it's now going to blend something into the white and nothing into the black. So what I'm going to show you how that looks is, so now it leaves the color in the crevices, and it blends this new color over the flat white spaces. But I don't want to do that. I want to create some interesting shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click space, start typing invert grayscale, and now I'm using my ambient occlusion as a mask. And if I just use a black color, it's the same. It's basically the same as blending my ambient occlusion over this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this some saturation and some color. So now my deep shadows are red or orange, and they can be bright. So they don't have to be technically shadowed. They can be whatever interesting color you want. So this is a fun way to add dirt to your model if you want to use the ambient occlusion as a mask and show like how an interesting like rusty dirt has built up in your crevices. And same thing for the curvature map. Curvature map's a bit more difficult because it's this 50% gray, so it's always going to blend something over the model. So what's easier for the curvature map is to use this gradient map. And the gradient map is useful because it'll turn any grayscale image into a recognizable color output. So in Substance Designer, a yellow means it has RGB color. A gray is just one channel gray. And so this can be useful for stuff like if you want to plug in your height map again and overlay that on your model, you can start using it with all the Photoshop blend modes. So overlay. Now it's filthy and disgusting. But we can do the same thing with our curvature map. And now the curvature is overlaid onto the model. Now turn that opacity down a little bit. And we're starting to see a model that looks a bit more cohesive and has all its details highlighted. Because again, without those two maps, you get something that looks very flat and the lighting is not described at all. So if we plug those guys back in, we're starting to get something that looks a bit more usable. So now I'm going to show you generators. Generators are where Substance Designer is really powerful. So what it does is it reads from your bakes and places things like dirt and scratches. And that's under your patterns, mesh adaptive generators. So this will generate masks for you. So you have under here you have things like something that generates dirt, which is like what I was doing with the ambient occlusion, except instead of just this clean gradient into the crevices, we can start to get something a bit more interesting. So I'm going to delete that mask, and I'm going to turn off this blending for a minute. And I'm going to plug my ambient occlusion into the dirt node. What you start to see is where the ambient occlusion is. Compare the two. Where there are shadows on here, there start to be shadows on here. The dirt's very powerful right now, so anything white is going to be dirty. But there's also a spot for your curvature, which is why we made that. And that starts to pop right away. So now we have this mask that is adding dirt to all the flat spaces and keeping the dirt very powerful in the crevices. So there's also nodes for the position, which we also made. So position. And that makes sure that it knows top to bottom. And then also for the world space normal map, which also helps it recognize top to bottom on each individual plane. So what we have here is it's kicking out a mask, and so I'm going to plug that in as the dirt mask instead of using the ambient occlusion. We're going to start to see some really interesting particle information. So it adds noise, adds things that you would start to expect from dirt. Make that a bit more dirt color. So I want dirt everywhere. And I can adjust the level, and it adjusts it for you. So it scales based on your baked information, which is why I had you bake so many fun different maps. That starts to be pretty fun. And then you can go back in and and blend your ambient occlusion back in so you keep the shadow information. Another gradient map. Start plugging my ambient occlusion, plug that in on top of everything, multiply, and now we have both dirt and lighting information. What's more is you can start to have edge wear and edge scratches. And what that looks like is, where's the good one? Edge damage. So edge damage works off your ambient occlusion and your curvature. And what it looks like when it masks it out is this. So it's not very extreme at first, so let's turn it up and get a good idea. So you'll notice that based on my ambient occlusion, there's an edge right here. That's the edge of the thing. It adds scratches. So what it's doing is it's deciding based on what is not recessed, so what is not dark in the ambient occlusion, and what is highlighted in the curvature must be an outer edge. So if this thing was dropped, if this thing rolled around for a little while, it's going to add scratches to those outer edges. If we plug this into the base color, we see that it did just that. Where there's these really strong, scratchy edges on the outside, slightly lighter ones on the inside, and nothing on the very inside, which is really cool and really helpful. So this one's interesting because you don't always want to represent scratches on something painted as just scratches in the paint, because paint doesn't scratch so much as come off. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this as a new mask, and we're going to say that maybe this box is made of gold under here. Maybe underneath this green stucco-y paint there's some gold, and we're going to do something really interesting. We're going to play with our color map. So what we know is that this multi-material blend is choosing all the blues and saying that that is gold. But what we want to do is we want to say that more things are gold. So we're going to use a blend node on the multi-material map. We have this edge damage mode, and this is black. This is a black and white mask. So we plug that in as the opacity, turn on the uniform color, and plug that in as the foreground. It's going to start to say, oh, put black where this edge damage is. But what do we know? We know that blue is golden. So if we choose our uniform color, use the color pick, and choose blue, what we start to get is these scratches are revealing gold underneath the paint. You can do this with anything. So if you add more materials, and say you add a shiny silver material, I'll do that right now, actually. So a third material, I'm going to use all the same settings as the gold, except instead of it being golden, I'm going to make it silver. So I'll take this color. Again, metals generally use flat colors. I'm going to turn down all the saturation, and it's going to be the silvery color. I'll show you how that looks in a second. If I were to plug this in as the gold, you'd see that, oh, that's shiny silver. So for the third material, I'm going to use this green. And this green will be very useful in a second. I'm going to select this. Let's see. Actually, I'm gonna decide what I want to blend in. So on this uniform color, I'm going to pick a random color. So say this very dark green. And now on the mask, there's this unaccounted for color. What we've told it before is that everything in material 1 will be the default. So by default, it's going to recognize this dark green as more of this stucco material. But we have a third color pick now. So if I select the multi-material, choose color pick, and choose this dark green, now we get shiny silver edges on the edge of our box, which means that this box was silver metal underneath this green paint. And go back to the edge damages and crank up the intensity, and we start to see more damage. Fun thing about Substance Designer, it is not picky about limits. So the slider only goes up 1 to 0, but you can type in anything you want. Say on some things. Actually, maybe not this one. Dang, never mind, I lied. But yeah, so oh, look at this. That's interesting. So the gold. This is suggesting that the gold was chipped away, and underneath was silver, and that's a little strange because that's not usually how metals work. So what we want to do is we note that the edge damage has a mask option. So we need to turn this blue into this red into a mask that says the edge damage will only apply to the red. What we have is a good node for that, and that's called color to mask. This is like a tiny selection node. So you plug in a color input, select red, and now it's a perfect mask, a black-white mask of just the spot that is green paint on here. Plug that in. Oops, not there. And now the scratches only apply to the material I want it to apply to. I can do this as many times as I want. Say I wanted it to also apply to the blue, or say I add more materials on there. Make a new color to mask, choose a different color. Make a blend node, combine them. Now this is interesting because I don't want to use copy. I don't want them to be half blended. I want to say that everything white on here between these two is going to be communicated here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to screen, and boom, they will lighten each other. They'll combine only their lightest elements. So now the black color is left off and the white color is left. Plug that in, and now it communicates the same thing. The gold is to be included. I don't want that. I'm going to plug this back in. So what we have here is a box with this edge material and dirt in the crevices. Some other fun stuff you can do. There's a lot you can play with. A lot of really helpful tutorials out there that cover more than I can cover in a short period of time. But there's stuff like, say, ground dirt, and I want the bottom to be more dirty than the top because this has been left in the dust. So what this wants is a grayscale position map, which is not what we have. What this means is that it only recognizes up and down rather than left, right, front, back. So what we want is also a bottom to top. And bottom to top translates your position map into a top to bottom mask. And plug that one in, and it says, ooh, now I know what is top and what is bottom. And use that as another mask. Blend that into the color map. Pick another dirt color. Say this one's a bit more muddy, so it's darker. It's more saturated, it's darker. Plug that in. Plug the mask in. And now we have mud at the bottom. Some other stuff you can do is you're not only going to be blending into the color map, because what starts to happen is now I have shiny brown metal down here. That doesn't make sense because the mud isn't turning the metal brown, it is lying on top of the metal. So I want to represent that as well. So I'm going to go into the metalness map, and I'm going to blend the black color into the metalness. So what I'm saying is this new thing is non-metal. So just overlay black over everything, everything becomes non-metal. But if I use the same mask, drag that in, now it starts to say that where there is mud, it starts to turn non-metal. And this is probably the only instance where you would see gray in the metalness map, is where something slightly transparent is layered on top of something that is metallic. So if mud particulates get on your metal, you'll see some of the metal through it, and it'll slightly reflect the light, but it's not gonna turn entirely non-metal or metal. And if that's starting to bother you, and if you don't like how that looks, you can also crank up the contrast of the dirt mask. So just like Photoshop, you have the levels modifier. And so what that does is it'll let you clamp things and increase the contrast. So I'm going to clamp the contrast, and it's going to turn it to essentially white and black. And so what we have in the metalness remains black and white instead of shades of gray. Other fun stuff. If you want to say you're making something that's going to be viewed from far away, and you need to exaggerate the lighting on it, you can use a light node. That uses the world space normal to cast a light mask. So what this does is, if we just plug it into the color map, we can start to see what this does. So right now it's saying that the light is facing from probably about this direction, and that is represented in this angle modifier. So we can decide where this mask is casting light on the object. So I want it from the top down, so that the top is brighter than the bottom, and from the slight angle. So it starts to light up the top, and the bottom is left dark. And so now we can convert it into a color map. So gradient map node, light into the gradient map, blend into the color line. We'll use an overlay, and that will exaggerate the color on the top and darken the color on the bottom. So just a bit more variation, make it feel a bit more grounded and lit within the world. So even if it's a standalone prop without lighting on it, you start to see some interesting stuff on it. Alright, I think I'm going to stop there, unless you guys have any questions.
You can kick out the final all combinations into a single map, right?
Oh, good question. Okay, yeah, so I'll show you how to export. So what you're exporting is each of these is a separate map, and I'll show you how to plug those in Marmoset now. Okay. So, always save your work. I didn't do that, and if things had crashed, that would have been very sad for me. Let's see. So right click, so you have your master file, and this can contain as many graphs as you like, but each graph is its own thing with its own set of outputs. So I'm going to right click on my graph, export outputs as bitmaps, and it's going to pop up this window. This window is going to let me check which maps I want to export, in this case all 4 of them, and where they're going to export to. Make this create demo. Select folder, and it will name the new images graph name underscore material name. So this will be graph underscore or demo underscore base color normal, so on and so forth. Export outputs. We'll say it's done. We can go into Marmoset. I can drag in my crate. That's point material. Use the default material and apply it. And over here I have my roughness, I have my normals, I have my albedo, and I have my metalness. Albedo is just a fancy word for color. So we're going to go to my demo, and now I have these 4 images. You can scroll through them and look at them flattened out. My color map, my metallic, my normal map, and my roughness. Drag them out. So drag color into albedo, normal to normal, metallic to metalness, and roughness to roughness. And what we see here is bad. And oh yeah, so this is the same thing as last week when I was showing video. So a lot of the reflections in default Marmoset are bad. Like some of these really bright ones don't tell much about your materials. So if you switch it to a more interesting dynamic outside sky image, you can start to get a better idea of what your materials look like. Switch to that one. I'm going to shine a light on it and add a shadow mask and turn up the light. And now I can preview my object.
Naturally, you can do the same thing with the FBX model and just slap on the textures.
That's right. Yeah, any FBX you can drag into Marmoset and slap textures on it. These can also be applied in Maya. I believe it's a Blend Fong material, has the roughness slot. But there's you can build basically any texture in Substance Designer. But I have not practiced the specular workflow, so I'm not as familiar with it. But if you need to demonstrate specular, you can also show that off or build that in Substance Designer and add that to Maya, add that to Marmoset, basically anywhere. But for most game engines, most modern game engines like Unreal, Unity, you're going to be wanting to use the roughness metalness workflow for the best PBR lighting. Anything else you guys want to see? All right, cool. So that was recorded.